Hello and welcome to Nigeria, the road to 2019, a series of programs where Arise News places the audience and the choice at the heart of our coverage of the upcoming presidential elections. I'm Charles Eniegulu. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, all the news, comment and analysis that provide unrivaled insight into Nigeria 2019, including over the next hour. It's taken some time for him to get to this point, many months, even years of speculation about whether Donald Duke, former governor of Cross River State, will run for president. Well, now he's heeded that call and we know that he will run. And now that his campaign is effectively underway, what's he got to offer the Nigerian people? Donald Duke, in person, coming up. Now, if celebrity could be transformed into electability, then Donald Duke, former governor of Cross River State and presidential candidate for the Social Democratic Party, has won the election hands down. Wherever he goes, he draws the crowds by the thousands, by the sheer force of his personality. It is perhaps not surprising that Duke, the politician, musician, motorbike enthusiast, broadcaster, civil servant and lawyer, inspires such awe. In addition to having loads of charisma and charm, his supporters say he transformed Cross River State from a rural backwater to the preeminent leader in West Africa in such areas as urban development, agriculture, communications, tourism and the environment. His critics, though, insist that his creation of attractions like Tinapa left the state with a crippling debt from which it is yet to recover. Today, Donald Duke's message of hope and transformation, as well as his crusade for liberation from the tyranny of the few over the many, grips his audiences of mostly young people, with many repeatedly chanting his name, calling on him to run for the highest office in the country. Well, now run he will as the presidential candidate for one of the biggest parties in Nigeria, the Social Democratic Party. But can he win? Well, let's hear from the man himself. I'd like to welcome the former two-term governor of Cross River State and currently the presidential candidate of the Social Democratic Party, Mr. Donald Duke. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charles.
Very honored to have you here.
I'm delighted.
It's not the first time you've tried to run for president, is it? I mean, why are you so determined to take the future of nearly 200 million Nigerians into your hands?
Charles, we're at the precipice. We are at a point where if we don't change the narrative of our country, we would pay dearly for it. And I think we're already doing that. I needn't remind you, for instance, that the twin evil that we face is a burgeoning poverty class and the consequences that arise from that. For instance, you know, from independence to date, we had at independence our population was 45 million. Today we are hovering, as you said, 200 million. When we were 75 in 1980, President Shagari budgeted about 25 billion annually for his 4 years. So every 4 years he spent about 25 billion or thereabout. Today at 198 or 99 million, 39 years after, our budget is 23 billion. Forget the trillions that we call it. If you divide 8.6 trillion by 360, which it's 23 billion. That's a society in regression. And we can no longer fold our arms and hope that someone will get on the saddle and do the right thing. And we have to give our country options. I believe that we're better than what we present. And it doesn't take us anywhere if we sit back and criticize and hope. You know, we've hoped for so long and nothing has changed. So I'm going to give it a shot and give it my best shot. And I think there are quite a number of people of goodwill who think that we're better than either the APC or what the PDP is presenting, or the, you know, and so this is a time.
Right, and of course the part of the problem is that the way that this country has been run over the past few years has been out of sync with what propriety in governance is all about.
Absolutely.
What are the
Absolutely.
values that you hold dear that would make your presidency different from what we've seen in the past?
You see, you need to identify the cardinal issues that we face. You have a nation of so many people, about a quarter or a fifth of the population of Africa, most of them living in abject poverty. We all know we're the poverty capital of the world. We deceive ourselves by saying that we're the largest economy in Africa, but that's a sheer factor of numbers. In terms of productivity, we're one of the least. And I believe about 80% of our population is dependent on the goodwill of about 20%. So every day you're constantly assaulted by requests for funds, for support, for this, for that. That's no way to grow a nation. So all the issues that you have, whether it's corruption, insecurity, and all the vices, those are the symptoms of the problems themselves. If people are well off, if people are able to look after themselves, they're not going to take on vices the way we have.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I don't mean to interrupt you there, the way this country has been run has been essentially reflected all those bad things that you're talking about. What I'm keen to get to is the values that you hold that would make you different from the other leaderships that Nigeria has had.
You know,
that's run
the sad
the ground,
thing is, if you use the buzzwords like accountability and all that, people say, well, we've heard that before. But that is it. You've got to see this mission as your life's work. And that would make meaning to your incarnation. That's what drives me. It's not enough, reeling out what we've done in the past. Yes, we did. I think we did a great job in Cross River. But in the context of Nigeria, we are a problem. So what am I going to do differently? I'm going to hold true to my words to ensure that it's done.
Right.
That there are consequences for doing the wrong thing and consequences for doing the right thing.
So let's try and unite all those disparate elements together. What is your overarching vision for Nigeria if you were to become president?
Building a nation that her people are economically productive and can fend for themselves. And that's a vague statement, but it carries a lot of punch in it. Our productivity output is so dismal in a developing country where we all ought to be busy because there's so much to be done that hasn't been done. So you've got to put people to work. We are a consumptive nation rather than a productive nation. Yet we're blessed with the means of productivity. We have the manpower, we have the resources. We don't have the leadership that can catalyze the manpower and the resources together to make it productive. I mean, how, for instance, can you want to grow an economy and tolerate bank interest rates in the upper 20s? That in itself is a disincentive to investment. And you ask for foreign investments, but you don't encourage local investments. You flare one of your lower hanging fruits, which is gas, which is energy, yet you're energy deficient. So it's not hard to grow the economy of this country and get people working. We have a housing deficiency of about 20 million. That in itself can absorb, if you're doing a million housing units a year, that can absorb easily 1 million people. You've got to focus on your agriculture. But agriculture will never work except you tie it to industry. And you can't tie it to industry as long as interest rates are in the upper 20s. And so your agriculture would permanently remain at the subsistence level.
And you're talking about expanding it to include the entire value chain.
Absolutely. But you can't do that if the banks are charging such interest rates. And the banks operate under the license the government has given them. But it's interesting that the government would license an airline, right, and regulate its fares, license a bank and would not regulate its fares. It doesn't make sense because banks are operating at other people's money. The depositor, that's other people's money. But if you don't grow this economy at above 10%, then you'll have the problems wouldn't go away. And I explained this. The government has said that we're out of recession. We're not. As long as your population growth is higher than your economic growth, you remain in recession. So we're under 2% in terms of economic growth, but over 3% in terms of population growth. So we're in perpetual regression because we're never going to catch up.
And how is your party, the SDP, moving and growing in Nigeria towards achieving your vision and your dream of becoming president in relation to the two biggest political parties, the APC and the PDP?
Well, we like most other politicians, we're capitalizing on the disenchantment of the many. And our focus is on social justice. And social justice in its wider connotation is ensuring that people have the means to fend for themselves. And our justice system is alive to our social inequalities. And that's the focus of it. And we want to remain true to that. Unfortunately, there are no ideological differences in Nigeria. These are just political platforms. And you find that the movement between the two parties, APC, PDP, they're just different sides of the same coin. Nigerians are yearning for something different. So the onus and the challenge for the PDP, for the SDP, is to ensure that this message, you've tried the rest, now come try the best. This message is availed to all Nigerians. But clearly, if you carry out a survey in this country, there's a lot of disenchantment along the way.
I think most people would agree with that. And is your candidacy as the SDP's presidential candidate now totally firm and unassailable?
Absolutely.
Because I understand that it is being challenged in court by one of those you defeated during the primaries, or perhaps more than one, but notably Professor Jerry Gannett.
He's the only one who has raised an eyebrow, which I really don't understand, because immediately after the primaries he congratulated me, then proceeded to court. But the grounds, in my mind, are flimsy, challenging not the results of the primaries, but my participation in the primaries. You can't challenge my participation in a constitutional office as long as I meet the terms. So I'm over the minimum age of 35, right? I'm a Nigerian citizen. I have no convictions. I don't know where he's going to go with that, but our party has moved on. So I don't see myself being challenged by him.
Well, I won't dwell on that.
I'm sure he'll come to terms with it sooner than later.
Right. Let's focus instead on your track record in executive political office. You were a two-term governor in Cross River State. What was your big achievement during that time?
I'll surmise it in one word: hope. You know, hope is that intangible element that makes us get up and strive. And I think we were able to rekindle hope in the people of Cross River. I mean, there's certain landmark projects, you know, people tell you, Budukadu Ranch, Tinapa, this, that. Yes, that's all fine. But I think more than anything else, we afforded the folks in Cross River that conviction or assurance that their tomorrow will be better than today, and certainly better than their yesterday. And that's what governance is all about: creating hope, creating assurance, getting people to strive to do better. So we were able to get the people to focus. We created a lot of jobs in the area of tourism, and that's the beauty of tourism. And our focus was also on agriculture. We had a focus. We were able to do the things that we said we would do, and in some instances excel them. So we were proudly Cross Riverian. That's what we need to make for Nigeria. We need to create that hope in the average Nigerian, so he strives to be better than he is and works hard at it. We don't, unfortunately.
I have to say that in fairness to what you're saying, I mean, I came to Cross River when you were the governor there, and there was this extraordinary sense of pride that a lot of the people had, and there was this sense that, you know, they were on a trajectory of hope, to use your word. Your critics, though, say that your 8-year tenure as governor of Cross River State plunged the state into nearly 100 billion naira in debt, and that debt has continued to grow and has kept Cross River State on its knees and in hock to those it owes. What is your reaction to that?
Folks will say something, you know, you've got to give a dog a bad name to nail it. We built Tinapa. Then subsequent administrations abandoned it. What did they expect? This is a nation that built a Jaukuta steel mill, one of the biggest steel complexes in the world, and abandoned it, you know. So it's not the borrowing that matters. It's what you do with the amount you borrow. I talked earlier about banks. They're there to give you the funds. Now, TINAPA is actually an interesting case. 15 banks have investment in TINAPA, including governments. I think Cross River has, in terms of one of the lower equity holders in the project. 15 banks investing in a project is a statement of assurance that it is a good project, okay? And if it weren't abandoned, I assure you, Charles, that by now Cross River would probably not require the Federation accounts to survive. We will still take it, of course, as a right, but we could do without it. And that was the plan, that by 2012 we would have weaned ourselves off the Federation accounts, so that we're not just a political entity within the context of Nigeria, but we're also an economic entity, which is what every state should aspire to be. We had Obudu Cattle Ranch, which was adjudged the 4th best resort in all of Africa, and certainly the best in West Africa. It was abandoned also, and it's now derelict. So the same thing, if governments don't build upon what the predecessors have done, you're going to have that. And while TINAPA may be recent, Ajaokuta is probably the worst example of an abandoned project in Nigeria.
Well, just going back to TINAPA, because your critics, for instance, say that it was poorly conceptualized and had already become a burden on Cross River State before you even left office, that you didn't address the policy and regulatory issues that should have been addressed before or whilst the project was being implemented, and that Cross River State simply did not have the capacity and the resources to sustain a concern of such magnitude.
No, I don't think it's Cross River State that does not or did not have the capacity. It's the leadership that did not have the capacity to see it through. That's all. Capacity is not a statewide thing. I mean, TINAPA went through with a judge by not only investors, KPMG and the like, and ECOWAS Fund and the IFC, and these are all entities that invested in the project. But the regulatory framework was declaring it a free zone. That's a regulatory free zone framework. And President Obasanjo, the commissioning, stated it quite clearly. The Federal Executive Council passed the regulations in council. It was not gazetted. But it wasn't seen to be an issue, right? It was a continuum of governance. So it wasn't a big deal. A year or so into President Yar'Adua's administration, the regulatory framework was obtained. Now that we've obtained it, what have we done with it? Because it was obtained, a few shops opened up in the place. It was certainly done. So you can't, yes, it was not gazetted, although it was passed in my time. But a year thereafter, it was obtained. And if we didn't build on that, which is what governance is all about, continuous upbuilding, then you can't hold the conceptor responsible.
Now, I mean, I don't mean to keep banging on about this, but obviously if you're going for the highest office in Nigeria, people want to know these details.
Absolutely.
And it concerns people that certainly the allegation is that the state that you presided over is submerged in debt, because there is concern that if you become president of Nigeria, you could lead the country in the same direction of huge borrowing to finance whatever takes your fancy, and that these debts could asphyxiate the hopes and the future of the country. What do you say to that?
Hogwash, it's not that at all. Cross River is not overburdened with debt. There's something about that. If you're borrowing, and let me say this, Charles, Cross River was the only state between 1999 and 2007 that got a federal government guarantee on any project. The only state in 8 years, and that was because of the quality and presentation of TINAPA. And before you get this, it goes to the debt management office, right? The debt management office would look at your debt credit ratio and determine, regardless of how well the project, if the project should fail, can you pay? And it went through all those checks and balances. Now, the plan was this. Upon commissioning and getting it off the ground, the project itself will be quoted on the stock market, right? And that would essentially get Cross River State, which was the co-guarantor of the debt, off the books. But we didn't. Even when we were still waiting to get the operating guidelines through, my advice was, to that extent, don't freeze the debt, because the federal government is holding you to ransom on this, and they can't hold you to ransom on one side and ask you to service the debt on the other side. You can't do that. So it's far from it. It met all the guidelines, all the tenets of a project that will be successful. But the managers thereafter felt that they should do their own thing.
Well, the bottom line is investors. I mean, there were no investors, really.
Well, there were equity holders, but the project had not been taken to the level where others would come in. For instance, Walmart, the global giant, was interested in Tinapa. On the strength of Tinapa, they bought Massmart in South Africa for 2.8 billion as their flagship on the continent. Massmart are the owners of Gain. But they were rebuffed by the state government. Having been rebuffed by the state government, and Massmart and Walmart would have been an incredible draw, because before I left, groups like the name skips me now, but big groups from the United States were making inquiry.
Well, in fairness to you, I filmed a lot of that Tinapa project. I filmed across Cross River State, and at the time that I went there seemed to be a tremendous amount of optimism from foreign investors who were there to look at it. And on the positive side, beyond sort of Tinapa and all of that, you're probably most widely known in Nigeria and across Africa for starting the Calabar Carnival, which quickly grew to become known as Africa's biggest street party, and that you transformed Cross River State from the poorest Niger Delta state with no oil money into the jewel of the Niger Delta and Nigeria, and indeed West Africa, as far as being the leader in tourism is concerned. How did you achieve that? Because that's a key point.
But doesn't that contradict? That contradicts those who say that we plunge the state into debt.
Well, I mean, we have to reflect the
that's why I say that
you've
got to give a dog a bad name to nail it.
Because I mean, this is crucial, because
Absolutely.
Nigeria is trying to diversify
away from
We were talking
oil. Diversification before it became the norm, right? Because we looked at two things. We looked at agriculture and we looked at tourism, where folks could not even understand the concept of tourism. And we were able to build an economy that drew in a lot of traffic. Calabar Airport became the fourth busiest airport in all of Nigeria after Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, Calabar. We had 9 flights in and out of Calabar daily. You know, Obuducado Ranch, a place hitherto unknown, became one of the busiest spots on the continent. But the beauty of tourism was that, you know, people were making money enough for government to tax from, and that's the problem with our economy. We have a top-bottom economy rather than a bottom-up economy, and we were able to do that. The traffic that comes into Calabar in December for the carnival, right? The governor says about 2-3 million, but in my time it was about 1 million people, and that is the busiest time. It drove the hospitality industry. You know, folks had jobs the month of December. People who had idle rooms in their homes were able to let them out and all that. And there was activity, and that's what an economy is all about, activity, you know, motion, moving things back and forth. We were the only state in the country that had internal flights, you know, between one part of the state to the other, scheduled. So it's, I long to see my country run in that direction. If we don't go that way, I shudder to think in another 30 years, when our population will be 400 million, how we would manage it.
Well, Donald Duke, please stay with us. We obviously want to talk with you some more. You're watching Nigeria, the road to 2019. Plenty more still ahead, including more of our discussion with Donald Duke, presidential candidate of the Social Democratic Party, and the man who promises that if elected, he will take Nigeria to a future that is full of hope and possibilities. Stay with us.
Thinking of banking in Africa? Think Zenith. In today's fast-moving, fast-changing world, you need a financial partner that understands your unique expectations. A bank with presence in major financial centers across the world, with the enabling platform to facilitate seamlessly, whenever, wherever, however. A bank with best-in-class financial solutions from a superb combination of technology and human touch for easy, fast and secure banking that creates real value. Turning dreams into reality is now in your hands. People, technology, service. Zenith Bank, in your best interest.
As a fashion writer, I know how quickly trends are created and changed. In business, it's no different. To stay ahead, I needed a plan flexible enough to meet my changing communication needs. More Business 2.0 didn't just give me voice and data in one package. I got a whole lot more. With More Business, setting up my website was no problem. But I'm not just a fashion writer. I also own a home decor store before I decided to open an accessory store. With my customized More Business plan, managing my staff's communication is easy. No matter how frequently they come, oh, there you go. With 9mobile's new online self-service this week, I could adapt my plans to include this.
From 2,000 Naira, choose a business bundle, customize your staff's voice and data lines, and enjoy a variety of add-on business services. Dial *200 *5# now to subscribe. More business.
Welcome back to Nigeria, the road to 2019. I'm Charles Aniekolu. Now 3 months to go before the February 2019 national elections. Amid so much chaos, despair and poverty, but also hope and exuberance as the political parties and their presidential candidates promise change and a better future, one that is pregnant with possibility. One such candidate who promises to redirect the course of Nigeria is the former two-term governor of Cross River State and currently the presidential candidate of the Social Democratic Party, Donald Duke. And Mr. Duke is with me in the studio. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you, Charles.
In addition, of course, to being a lawyer and a politician, you are, of course, also a musician, a saxophonist, a motorbike enthusiast. So creativity, quite big in your cosmology.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a passion I have.
You also made a very important film out of Cross River State.
Yes, we did, and we enjoyed doing that. It's that creativity that I think is not unique to Donald Duke. It's in millions and millions of Nigerians, and they have been frustrated from bringing it to the fore. And we must create the environment for folks to express themselves, and that's where the greatness of our nation will be appreciated. And that's, my fundamental thing is create an environment where skills are brought to bear. So you've got to educate the people, you've got to have good healthcare and good infrastructure, and an environment where you can walk into a bank with a good idea and borrow money and build on something. And right now we don't have that. Millions of our people are out of school. Right, there are geniuses there that are not able to express themselves. We shudder to think of what will happen to us if we fall ill. And he doesn't talk about infrastructure. So this is clearly an underperforming nation, and most of us will never achieve our full potential. That's a frustrating life.
That is, in fact, and I'm sure a lot of people would be glad to hear you talking about these things, because it just doesn't seem to figure with a lot of other candidates. And I was looking at reports of the fight against corruption, which is something that figures with other candidates. When you were governor of Cross River State, Nuhu Ribadu was head of the EFCC, the anti-graft agency. Mr. Ribadu said in 2006 that out of all the governors being investigated for corruption, the 36 governors across the state, you were the only governor who was not under investigation for corruption.
Well, I am proud of that as a resume, and it sits well with me, and some legacy that I'm sure my children and friends and peers will be proud of. But coming back to corruption, the pressure on the average Nigerian, not just the governor, today we have a society where the rich are crying, they're under pressure. There's hardly anyone who is not assaulted by messages and begging for some support for one thing or the other. But let me put it in a more graphic terms. There are two types of corruption, and corruption is symptomatic of a bigger problem. There's a corruption of need. The poor fellow who has a job, for instance, but his take home does not take him home, and the dependency that he has to support is so high that he has to make ends meet one way or the other. That's a corruption of need. That policeman who has 5 kids, you know, aged parents, a daughter who has appendix, and the doctor's asking for 50,000 naira before she's operated on, and his salary is just 30,000. He would take to corruption like fish to water. What we are focused on is the corruption of greed, because he must be in an opportune position to award contracts and benefit thereof. But in terms of numbers, the corruption of need is much more. In terms of value, it's much more. The corruption of greed is evidentiary of weak institutions, right? A weak judiciary. And I'll give you an example. You know of the governor of Plateau State, for instance, who the offense was committed in 2002, 2003, and only got sentenced this year, which is about 13 years thereafter. One thing we learn in law is justice delayed is justice denied. So as long as the system is so weak and does not adjudicate promptly, then you are aiding, and in some cases abetting also corruption. But that of need is far larger in terms of quantum of numbers, and therefore you need to build a productive society where we don't have to dependent on others for our survival. And that's where the focus ought to be. So this corruption is not in our DNA that we should be corrupt, but our society aids it by not working at engaging and growing the productive capacity of the average Nigerian. That's the real kernel of the problem. Same thing with insecurity. It all comes down to the growing poverty class that we have.
And that obviously brings me to the issue of the economy. The way that will play out at these campaigns is very much an important part of the election in February, isn't it?
It should. Because it's a central theme of it all. I've said over and over again in this discourse that poverty and low productivity is the kernel of Nigeria's problems. And we should define how we would tackle it. Recently, the government said that the ease of doing business has, Nigeria's gone up there, or gone...
It's improved, basically.
But what are you talking about ease of doing business when there's zero productivity in the economy? Companies are shutting down. The best of them are operating below 50% capacity. We are basically a consumer market where even the multinationals, most of them import the products and just repackage them in Nigeria. Recently, Procter & Gamble shut down a factory that cost $300 million to build. No questions have been asked. When you shut down a factory, jobs are lost. And if you're not operating at full capacity, how are you going to service your interests? Because when you went to the bank, you must have said, okay, well, at least function at 50 to 60% capacity. But if you're at 30% capacity, you can't. And let me give you an example, Charles. Let's say you take a loan of 100 million from a Nigerian bank. You'll be paying upwards of about 25 to 30 million annually for your first year, that is, to service the loan. Your cost of doing business is almost 50%. If you're not able to generate from 100 million, 70 to 80 million naira, you can't remain in business for your first year. That is so restrictive. For an economy that has to create so many jobs to be so frustrated, we need to address that. And like I said earlier on, we need to grow this economy between 10 to 15%. Nigeria with her population ought to be a $2.5 trillion economy. we need to grow this economy between 10 to 15% annually for the next 10 years, non-oil, right? To grow it, to engage the vast numbers of our people. So telling me that we're doing 1.2 or 2% is so abysmal, so unambitious. We will never get out of this poverty conundrum that way.
Some people have argued that the best way to really make Nigeria productive is, it doesn't matter what you say, because there's so many things that hamstring development and growth in this country, that the best way to do it is to entirely restructure the country politically, economically. Is it possible to judge or gauge at this stage how this debate about restructuring will play out at the election? Will it be a big hot potato election issue for your party, the SDP?
It ought to be, but it's not. I'll say this: we ought to restructure. We were a restructured nation until 1966, when we had the unitary system, when the military played a dominant role in our politics. Restructuring essentially allows each component unit, in our time now it's a state, before it was a region, to grow at their pace and contribute a certain amount for the running of common services, which is what the federal government is all about. But the critical thing, while I support and I would encourage and ensure that we restructure the country, all it means is go back to your 1963 constitution and start from there, okay? No state must be left behind. It's critically important, because you're as strong as your weakest link. And we see it happening in the northeastern parts of our country. That's the poorest part of the country, and that's why the war there, which has gone on longer than the Civil War, cost more lives than the Civil War, and is far more expensive than the Civil War, has continued, because, you know, apart from the fact that I believe that there's the economics of the war going on now, and the corruption that is fueling it to its sustainability, such issues thrive in a poverty belt. So we should restructure, but no state must be left behind. But I'll say this as a caveat: restructuring is no panacea for good governance. At the end of the day, you must still have good governance to appreciate the value of restructuring.
And what about, I mean, I don't want to go on too much about the restructuring thing, because I would have been keen to get your...
I'd like to talk about it, though.
Well, I'd be quite keen to get your sense of how this restructuring is actually going to take shape under your government. I mean, you're talking about states moving at their own pace, but you're also talking about going back to the 1963 constitution, which is essentially a regional situation, that Nigeria had regional government. Which is it going to be for the SDP?
Well, take the region now to mean the state today. Okay, so in other words, what each state, the things that states ought to do, education, you know, there's too much in the concurrent line and all that, you know. So let the states essentially run all aspects of their lives.
So you devolve more powers to them.
I don't want the word, you see, the word devolution is as if the federal government is being gracious to give back what is mine, right? Apart from the common services, foreign affairs, defense and all that, policing, for instance, should go back to the states. At one time, it was local, absolutely local. And policing has to be local. Why? Because you cannot police an area you don't know. Ordinarily, at 200 million, we should have 2 million policemen. It's 1 to 100. But we have only 300,000. Half of them are with VIPs, right? So we're thoroughly under-policed. And there's absolutely no way you're going to get the federal government to employ 2 million people. Literally every public service, civil service in Nigeria is over-bloated. You don't need to employ new people. You could just take folks from the existing public service, retrain them in policing, right? And they don't have to wear uniforms. 80% of policing is intelligence gathering, right? And only 20% is enforcement. So you need to get more folks involved in our policing. Those are the sort of things that we talk about in restructuring and all that. But like I said, no state ought to be left behind. So it cannot be restructured in one fell swoop. There'll be a time frame. And in the course of the time frame, there'll be certain support mechanisms, right, that would enable the states, because the crux of restructuring is fiscal. States are wondering how will we survive economically. The good thing about Nigeria and what we were able to prove in Cross River is that every state in Nigeria can make something of itself. We made something of tourism when nobody thought about it. Like you said earlier on, we are the poor cousins in the Niger Delta. We don't have any oil. But the dream there was to ensure that all those folks with the billions they spent will spend it in Cross River. And it worked. I mean, folks will get married in Akwa Ibom State and have their receptions in Calabar, you know, because it was picturesque, it was nice, and, you know, and all that. So every state has to do a SWOT analysis and determine what its strengths and weaknesses are. There's hardly any state in Nigeria. I mean, a state like Bayelsa, for instance, which is a smaller state, 900,000 people, is oil rich. A state like Zamfara today that we look at as a poor state has one of the largest gold deposits anywhere in the world. Nasarawa State is a mineral belt. As long as you don't restructure and allow the states just exist at the grace of the federal government, you know, they would never develop their potential, because you have to wean them off. This dependency syndrome does not enable them to strive. We were determined to get off the federation accounts. And so we looked at it, we did a SWOT analysis, we knew where our strengths were, we knew where our weaknesses were, our position. Look, Cross River is at the end of Nigeria. You only go there if you have reason to go there. So we needed to cause traffic to go there. That's what Dubai is all about, causing traffic to come. London, all these big cities, without traffic, they're not viable, right? So you've got to get people active. And that's the oil industry, for instance, is only 8 or 9% of our GDP, employs less than 0.5% of our population. So in terms of productivity, it adds really nothing in real terms. So look at agriculture, look at housing. 20 million housing shortage is a challenge, but also a great opportunity too.
And you talked earlier about the police and growing the police and retraining them and so on. And that brings me to that very big constituency, the demographic of young people, many of them unemployed, that everyone has suddenly woken up to their voting clout, at least potentially. How are you tapping into that constituency?
Well, it's one thing to see them as a voting bloc, but also they should demand, after voting, what are you going to do for me? You need to create jobs, you need to provide opportunities for them. There are a lot of folks out there who have gotten some basic form of education, but they're frustrated. Remember, the chant Boko Haram was the evil of Western education. That's what Boko Haram means. In other words, the people at that point in that part of the country were frustrated that Western education was not bringing them any good. Drawing a leaf from there, we recognize that our population is very youthful and energetic and a source for political gains. It would be a terrible thing if we keep them constantly frustrated, and that's what's happening today. And so I would like us, the political class, to quickly address it, because it's a time bomb. It is a time bomb. I mean, 60-70% of the people are 35 and below. That could be a force for good, but it could also be a force for disaster.
Absolutely. And is there a big, well, I mean, you've just identified that generational divide in Nigeria between the young sort of 18 to 35 age bracket and the more gerontocratic group that are maybe in their 60s and up, and who traditionally hold political power in Nigeria? Do you find that you and the youth have more in common and their expectations are more closely aligned with yours?
Absolutely, but I'll tell you, I'm actually getting out of that generation that can say I'm youth, right? Fortunately for me.
Well, you're not 60 yet.
I'm not. That's why I said I'm getting out of that generation. But look at what the two major parties have done. Both candidates, one celebrated his 72nd or thereabout just yesterday. For a population so young, right? There is a disconnect. There is absolutely a disconnect, and I'll exemplify it to you. The president signs a bill, not too young to rule. Right? His party sets the cost of obtaining forms for elective offices at 45 million for the president, right? I think the cheapest or the lowest price was about 5-10 million. That in itself you're creating a barrier for young people to participate in politics. And that's the disconnect we're talking about. They are totally out of sync with the reality of our country. You know, young people must be extremely frustrated. They see what's happening. They're more globally connected, and they see what's happening with their counterparts abroad. I mean, you talk of Zuckerberg. He is youth. You don't come more youthful than that. Being a billionaire and all that. The young people are making strides. But here, they're just as brilliant. But their governments don't, you know, a basic idea like Tinapa, for instance, that, or what does it do? It just draws traffic. When Tinapa was built, it was bigger than the biggest mall in Dubai at the time. What did we do with it? We let it, because we're totally out of sync with current realities, and it's getting worse. So if either of these two behemoths should return to power, and I say return because either of them have been there one time or the other, the divide will only get steeper and deeper.
And I mean, you touched on that big attitudinal difference between the older generation and the young, and those are the issues on which there are a general divide, you would say?
Basically, yes. But deeper still is a lack of vision by both. You can't do the same thing over and over again and get the same result and think you're making progress. Recently, one of the candidates said he was going to bring down the price of petroleum products to 90 naira a litre, and that's hogwash. You buy the product at 300 or 350 naira and sell it at 90 naira. It doesn't make sense. You wouldn't do that yourself. You wouldn't buy a product at X amount at 300 naira and sell it at 100 naira. And why are we looking at that? There are other things that you can subsidize that would touch Nigerians. I, for instance, would look at taking all that money we spend on subsidizing fuel for a few. And that's why you have folks who, when they go on a convoy, they have 10 cars because fuel is cheap, relatively, and you can traffic it across the borders. Subsidize what you're flaring. Take gas, for instance. Why are you selling gas at the international price, right, to those who use it, but you flare the bulk of the gas we produce, right? Gas is being sold at about $7 or some international price, but you're flaring the bulk of it. That's what you can subsidize. You can only subsidize what you've got, not the things you import. It will make better sense to take all that 1.2 or 1.5 trillion that you spend, and don't forget our budget is about 8.6 trillion. So a good chunk of it, about 15% of it, goes into subsidizing fuel for a very few. How many people have cars in the context of the larger population? But we want every Nigerian to be trained. I believe every brain untrained is a drain on the nation. So every Nigerian should have the opportunity of getting a skill. I would put all that money into education. But recognizing that living is challenging in Nigeria, I would drastically cut the price of gas. Most of the electricity we use in Nigeria is thermal from gas. That would affect a vast number of people. I want to ensure that even our factories, right, have cheap energy so that they can increase their capacity utilization, employ more people, right? Get them off the national grid. Let the national grid service domestic and small scale, but the larger factories go on gas, and therefore all this gas you're flaring distributed nationwide. Have 5,000 kilometers of gas pipelines and ensure that every part of this country is gas service. And that's something that will grow the economy drastically. I'm telling you that you need to grow this economy between 10 to 15%.
It's very interesting, the things you say, and clearly will resonate with quite a lot of people in Nigeria, except your opponents, of course. But the question is, how are you going to get this very important message out to people in Nigeria?
You've got to campaign.
When you're
facing
off against two very powerful, very wealthy political parties.
Did you ever watch the wrestling match between Power Mike and Alibaba?
Well, I vaguely remember somebody called Power Mike. I think I was in diapers when he was.
These were the two wrestling giants globally. They went for this match and both of them knocked themselves and they had a double knockout. I think what's going to happen, these two folks are going to knock out themselves right? But the truth must be told. We must give Nigerians options. We're not limited to these two gentlemen who have not excelled when given the opportunity. Nigerians must be given the opportunity to, let's try something else. And that's what we're presenting ourselves as.
Right, and you've talked about a lot of things. You talked very interestingly about the economy, about corruption, about security, about the youth, restructuring, all the things that you expect will be discussed in an issue-driven election. How might all that play out in February?
Well, I'm hoping that we have a listening electorate who's not swayed by 4,000 or 5,000 naira on the voting day. I hope that as we get into the campaigns, more of these issues come to the fore, and people get to realize that a 4,000 naira on the day of elections is just pittance. I hope so. Now,
does that mean you don't have 5,000 naira to give to them?
I don't. And then if I did, I will not. Let me tell you.
I think that's a very safe answer.
Let me tell you something. The PDP primaries, which I watched closely, was the same day as my primary. A lot of money was spent, right? I'm told on that day there was no foreign exchange in the Nigerian market. INEC has to get involved in this. INEC ought to disqualify aspirants or candidates who induce voters or delegates. You cannot have a transparent process where openly, and INEC admits this, openly they're inducing voters with amounts of money. That party should immediately be disqualified from the elections, and it wouldn't happen again. Or you go for primaries and delegates are giving vast amounts, $5,000-$10,000. That's unheard of, and we cannot have an enduring democracy if we allow that to happen. And if there are no consequences, it will continue to happen. And this is where INEC is flaying seriously, not just failing, it's flaying its duties, responsibilities. It should, if in Oshun or Ekiti, where this was the game at play, if it had happened, all parties would have sit up and not repeat it. And I hope they're listening, and I hope they borrow a leaf and make it very clear to the party that any sign of inducement, you'll be automatically disqualified.
Well, they've certainly made noises in that direction.
Well, they've brought attention to it, but
we'll have to see if they follow it up with action.
They have to.
Finally, Mr. Duke, and we appreciate very much your taking the time to be with us. What is your overarching message to the Nigerian people? How can they fold your story and your presidential aspiration into the larger Nigerian story?
The interesting thing this time around, other than President Buhari, I'm the only other aspirant who has headed a government, or the other candidate that has headed a government. And so I have a record. Vice President Atiku Abubakar has not headed a government. He's been a number 2, and so he can't take credit for what number 1 did as much as he would like to. And all the other 75 other, about 75 other candidates have not had the opportunity. So we have a track record. We cannot take chances. Regardless, does my message sync with the populace? Do we agree that productivity is a kernel problem for all of us? Do we agree that impunity or lack of consequences is a challenge for this nation? If we do, who has a track record to do it? Is it the PDP that is in impunity personified? Is it the APC that has not been able to check itself? I mean, they came into office on the platform of corruption, fighting corruption and insecurity. Insecurity is ballooning, it's getting worse. Unfortunately, our soldiers are being imperiled. Now it's as if Boko Haram has taken the war to the Nigerian troops and not the other way around. Corruption is not getting any better, So we need to change strategies, and that's what I'm offering. And that's what I'm hoping that Nigerians would appreciate. Yes, we're not the largest party, but it's not the largest that is the smartest. I mean, Goliath was big, but he was brought down when it mattered. So it's the game of strategy.
And on that bucolic note, Mr. Donald Duke, former two-term governor of Cross River State and currently the presidential candidate of the Social Democratic Party, SDP, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this edition of Nigeria at the Road to 2019. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.